Winter, 1285. The Carpathian passes. The snow falls in sheets, not the soft romantic flakes of childhood imagination, but hard granular ice that cuts exposed skin and builds in the creases of leather armor. Mongol horsemen, veterans of campaigns across Asia, men who had ridden through deserts and steppes, pushed their mounts through drifts that reached the animals' chests. The horse's breath comes in ragged clouds. Some have already stopped breathing. Behind them, stretching back through the narrow mountain defile, an army is dying. Not from battle. From cold. From hunger. From the simple physics of a supply train that cannot keep pace with the men it's meant to feed. Talabuga Khan stops his horse on a ridge. 44 years ago, an army much like his, led by Batu Khan and the legendary Subutai, swept through these same mountains in 3 days. They had encountered natural barriers that the Hungarian king himself had personally supervised. Dense tangles of felled trees, artificial hedges, ditches, earth mounds. Specialized Mongol units had cleared them all at what European observers called lightning speed. The Hungarian forces had scattered before them like leaves. By April of 1241, nearly 60,000 Hungarians lay dead on the field at Mohi, and the kingdom was a smoking ruin. The Mongols had left Hungary a wasteland. 50 to 80% of settlements in the plains destroyed. Between a quarter and half of the entire population dead, perhaps 300,000 to 500,000 people. It should have been final. Definitive. The kind of destruction from which kingdoms do not recover. But now, watching his men collapse in the snow, Talabuga realizes something is different. This invasion should be easier than the last. The route is the same. The tactics are the same. The Mongols are still the most fearsome military force on earth. Yet everything is wrong. To understand what happened, how one of history's greatest military powers broke itself against a kingdom it had already destroyed, you need to know what it was really like in the years between. You need to understand what desperation builds. And you need to see how one man's obsession with preparation could transform an entire nation's capacity to resist. King Béla IV stood on the docks at Troger, a fortified island town off the Dalmatian coast. He had been there for weeks, watching the horizon. The Mongol detachment that had pursued him across Hungary, through Austria, down the length of Croatia, had laid siege to the town in March. Then, without explanation, they withdrew. The news took time to reach him. Ogidi Khan, the great Khan, was dead. Batu Khan needed to return to Mongolia with sufficient forces to influence the succession. The Mongol Empire, for all its terrifying efficiency, operated on bloodline politics. Béla's return to Hungary in May 1242 revealed the cost of his survival. Contemporary sources describe the kingdom as resembling the aftermath of an apocalypse. The capital at Esztergom, what the Mongols hadn't burned. The traditional seats of administration, leveled. The earth and timber fortifications that had ringed the kingdom, ashes. The plains east of the Danube were nearly depopulated. Those who had survived did so in one of two ways. They had hidden in the forests and mountains, or they had taken refuge in the handful of stone fortifications that dotted the kingdom. The count was stark, 10 stone castles. In the entire kingdom. Half of them along the border with Austria. Places like Esztergom, Székesfehérvár, and Pannonhalma Abbey had held. Everything else, the wooden palisades, the earthworks, the clay brick walls that had been sufficient against other European armies. The Mongols had reduced them with methodical ease using catapults and fire. Béla was not a military genius. Medieval chroniclers describe him as intelligent and brave but not a battlefield commander. What he possessed instead was a capacity for clear-eyed assessment. He had spent months fleeing, watching his kingdom burn, understanding with each desperate mile exactly how his defenses had failed. He knew something else, something that gnawed at him through sleepless nights. The Mongols would return. They had sent ultimatums before the first invasion, demanding submission. Batu Khan's withdrawal was tactical, not strategic. The Mongol Empire did not abandon conquered territories. It consolidated them. In 1247, Béla wrote to Pope Innocent IV. The letter survives. In it, he outlined his plan to strengthen the Danube, which he called the River of Confrontations, with new fortifications. The language is not triumphant. It is the prose of a man preparing for an enemy he knows he cannot defeat in the field. The Mongols had demonstrated their tactical superiority so completely that any king who witnessed Mohi and still believed in conventional military victory was delusional. But Béla had noticed something. The Mongols were brilliant at destroying armies. They were brilliant at devastating undefended territory. But they were not patient. They had bypassed the stone castles. Their campaign depended on speed. They needed to move west, to chase the king, to prevent Hungary from consolidating its forces. A siege required time. And time was the one thing the Mongol operational tempo could not afford. The transformation began with a single, revolutionary decision. Béla abandoned the ancient royal prerogative to build and own all castles. For a medieval king, this was extraordinary. Castles were the physical manifestation of power. They controlled territory. They collected taxes. They enforced the king's will. By allowing barons, prelates, and even lesser nobles to construct their own fortified strongholds, Béla was distributing royal authority in a way that his predecessors would have considered dangerous to the point of treason. He did it anyway. The decree went out in the mid-1240s. Build castles on suitable sites where the people may find refuge if they have to retreat from threatening dangers. Not just military fortifications. Civilian refuges. The entire strategic conception had shifted from trying to stop the Mongols to trying to survive them. The labor was staggering. Between 1242 and 1270, somewhere between 147 and 172 new stone fortifications rose across Hungary. Over 40 in the first 10 years alone. This was not a building program. It was a national industrial project undertaken by a kingdom that had just lost a quarter of its population. Consider the logistics. Stone had to be quarried. In a kingdom where most construction had been timber and earth, the expertise for working stone had to be imported or trained from scratch. Master masons came from the Holy Roman Empire, from Italy, from anywhere Béla could recruit them. Sites had to be surveyed, not just for strategic value but for geological suitability. A castle on unstable ground was worse than no castle at all. The locations tell the story of Béla's strategy. Most of the new fortifications clustered along the Danube and in western Hungary, not in the devastated eastern plains where the Mongol invasion had done its worst damage. This puzzled some historians, who argued the castles must have been intended to defend against European rivals, not Mongol invaders. But the placement makes sense when you understand Béla's thinking. The eastern plains were depopulated. The labor force, the quarries, the infrastructure needed for stone construction, they simply didn't exist there anymore. The western regions still had concentrated populations, river access for transporting materials, and the basic institutional capacity to undertake construction. Moreover, Béla understood that the Danube was Hungary's defensive spine. If the Mongols returned, they would once again sweep through the eastern approaches. The castles along the Danube and in the western territories weren't meant to stop that initial assault. They were meant to create a defensive depth that would exhaust the Mongol advance, provide refuge for the population, and prevent the complete devastation that had occurred in 1241. The king didn't just build fortifications. He moved populations. In 1248, he relocated the citizens of Pest to a hill on the opposite side of the Danube. Within 2 decades, their new fortified town, Buda, became the commercial heart of Hungary. The castle he built there, beginning between 1247 and 1265, sat atop Castle Hill with commanding views of the river approaches. At Visegrad, another new fortress went up around 1247. It didn't follow the traditional pattern of sitting adjacent to a road. Instead, the road passed through the fortress itself. Travelers had to enter the fortification, making it a choke point that could be closed instantly. The design came from southern Germany, adapted to Hungarian conditions. At Eger, construction began in 1248 on what would become one of the kingdom's mightiest castles. The bishops who administered it used their wealth to expand not just the military installations but the entire town, creating a fortress city that could sustain a siege. The military reforms were equally comprehensive. Hungary's forces in 1241 had relied heavily on light cavalry, mobile, lightly armored troops that were devastatingly effective against other European armies. Against the Mongols, who had perfected light cavalry warfare over centuries, they were outclassed. Béla made agreements with military orders. In 1247, he granted the Knights of St. John the southeastern borderland in exchange for training and equipping heavy cavalry in the Western style, knights in full plate armor. These were the troops who had performed best at Mohi. The few contingents of heavily armored Knights Templar had fought effectively in close combat, even as the light Hungarian cavalry was shot to pieces by Mongol arrows. In 1248, a decree allowed the country's middle strata to enter a baron's service, provided the barons equipped them properly with armor for service in the royal army. This was social engineering through military necessity, creating a new class of armored cavalry by offering social advancement in exchange for military capability. The kingdom welcomed immigrants, tens of thousands from the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, Italy. They brought expertise, filled the depopulated lands, and increased the tax base that funded the endless construction. Béla even invited Jewish families, granting them citizenship rights in exchange for investment and skilled trades. The king needed money, and he needed it continuously. Because castle construction is expensive. Staggeringly so. Each fortress required years of labor, master craftsmen, supply chains for materials. Béla essentially mortgaged the kingdom's future to barons and prelates, granting them land and privileges in exchange for their commitment to build and maintain fortifications. The costs were political as well as financial. The power that Béla distributed to make the castle-building program possible undermined the centralized royal authority he had spent his early reign trying to consolidate. His own son, Stephen, would eventually rebel against him in a civil war from 1261 to 1266, partly over these very concessions to noble power. But Béla built anyway, because the Mongol threat was not theoretical. In 1254, Batu Khan sent a demand. Hungary should provide a marriage alliance and contribute a quarter of its army for a Mongol drive into Central and Western Europe. In exchange, Hungary would be spared tribute and destruction. Béla ignored it. In 1259, another ultimatum arrived from Berk Khan, Batu's successor. Same terms. Same implicit threat. Béla ignored that one too. Another in 1264. Ignored. The castles kept rising. When the Mongol invasion force crossed into Hungary in the winter of 1285, they expected to repeat 1241 success. Nogai Khan led forces through Transylvania from the south. Talabuga commanded the main army through the northern Carpathian passes, the same route Batu and Subutai had used. The winter campaign was itself strategic. Nomadic armies traditionally launched campaigns in spring, when the grass was fresh and horses could graze. But the Mongols calculated that a winter invasion would catch Hungary unprepared, the nobility dispersed to their estates, the king unable to concentrate forces quickly. The plan failed before the Mongols even reached the Hungarian heartland. Talabuga's army encountered the heavy snows of the Carpathians. This shouldn't have mattered. Mongol forces had crossed mountain ranges in every season. But the snow in the winter of 1285 to 1286 was exceptional even by Carpathian standards. The cold was not the clean, dry cold of the Asian steppes. It was wet, penetrating, the kind that finds every gap in clothing and saps strength with relentless efficiency. The Mongol supply system depended on speed and foraging. They carried minimal provisions, expecting to live off the land and capture enemy supplies. But in the Carpathians in winter, there was nothing to forage. The local populations had 44 years to learn the lesson. When invasion threatened, take everything valuable into the castles. Burn the rest. Sources from the period, the Galician-Volhynian Chronicle and Polish accounts, describe the result with grim precision. Talabuga's force was devastated by logistical factors. Thousands of soldiers died not from combat but from starvation and exposure. Allied contingents of Alans and Circassians, recruited to supplement the Mongol corps, deserted en masse. The army that was supposed to overwhelm Hungary as it had in 1241 began hemorrhaging strength before it even engaged the enemy. When Talabuga's diminished force finally emerged from the mountains, they found a landscape transformed. The towns they approached were either empty or fortified. Small garrison forces launched raids from castle walls, harassing the Mongol columns, then retreating behind stone ramparts. Every castle the Mongols bypassed became a base for these attacks, nibbling at supply trains, killing stragglers, denying the invaders rest. The Mongols tried to take several fortified positions. They failed. The stone walls held against their catapults and fire arrows. The defenders, supplied from storerooms stocked for exactly this contingency, could wait. The Mongols could not. In Transylvania, Nogai's southern force had initial success raiding towns like Regin, Brasov, and Bistrica. But they faced the same problem. The major fortifications were impregnable without lengthy sieges, and time was against them. Local Hungarian forces, Saxons, Vlachs, and Szekelys under Voivode Roland Borsa, used the castle network to coordinate resistance. They ambushed Mongol columns, contested river crossings, and avoided the open field battles where Mongol cavalry superiority would be decisive. Near Pest, King Ladislaus IV finally engaged Talabuga's main force with the royal army. The Hungarians had learned from 1241. Heavy cavalry, properly deployed, could hold against Mongol attacks. Infantry with crossbows, which had proven effective in limited deployment at Mohi, were now present in significant numbers. The battle was not the one-sided slaughter of 1241. The Mongols were driven back. On the retreat through the Carpathians, the Szekely people, a Hungarian ethnic group settled in Transylvania specifically as border defenders, ambushed the withdrawing Mongol forces. It was the final humiliation. An invasion force that had entered Hungary expecting easy conquest was now being hunted through mountain passes by local militias. Talabuga's armies suffered catastrophic losses. Nogai's forces, though they had caused damage in Transylvania, retreated in spring 1286 after failing to take any major fortifications. The outcome, as one source puts it, could not have contrasted more sharply with the 1241 invasion. The Mongols never seriously threatened Hungary again. 44 years. That's how long it took to build a defense that worked. The transformation wasn't dramatic in the way we usually think of military turning points. There was no single battle where Hungary's new army defeated the Mongol horde in glorious combat. There was no secret weapon in the sense of a technological innovation that changed the rules of warfare. What Hungary built was infrastructure. Hundreds of stone fortifications, yes, but more than that, a distributed system of defensive depth that changed the operational calculus for an invasion. The Mongols in 1241 could afford to bypass a handful of stone castles because there were so few. The Mongols in 1285 would have had to bypass hundreds, which meant leaving hostile fortifications in their rear at every stage of their advance, creating a defensive network that bled them continuously. The secret was time. The Mongol way of war demanded speed, rapid advances, quick decisive battles, swift consolidation. Stone castles imposed delay. Each fortress the Mongols bypassed became a threat. Each one they tried to take cost days or weeks they couldn't spare. The longer the campaign lasted, the more their logistical advantages eroded and their weaknesses, operating far from their base, in unfamiliar terrain, dependent on foraging, became critical. Béla IV died in 1270, 15 years before his fortifications proved their worth. He never knew if his obsessive building program would work. He never saw the vindication of his strategy. What he saw was his kingdom transformed from a smoking wasteland into a nation of castles, his royal power diluted to make it happen, his relationship with his own son destroyed over the political costs of those concessions. The chroniclers of his time gave him the epithet, second founder of the state. It was accurate. He rebuilt Hungary not by restoring what had been, but by creating something new. A kingdom whose strength was not in its ability to field a single decisive army but in its capacity to endure, to absorb punishment, to deny an invader the quick victory that their entire military system required. When modern historians analyze the Mongol campaigns in Europe, they focus on Mohi, the brilliant double envelopment, the feigned retreat, the devastating pursuit. The 1285 invasion gets less attention because it was less dramatic. There were no massive battles. No tens of thousands dead in a single day. Just a grinding, frustrating campaign where nothing worked the way it was supposed to, where the logistics failed, where the castles held, where the invasion force bled strength until retreat became inevitable. That's what victory looked like. Not glory, but frustration. Not a single heroic stand, but hundreds of small refusals to yield, scattered across a landscape that had been specifically engineered to resist. The Mongol Empire was the largest continuous land empire in history. It conquered territory from Korea to Hungary. It defeated armies that outnumbered it. It adapted to every form of warfare it encountered. But it was built for a particular kind of war. Mobile, decisive, conducted in the kind of open terrain where cavalry could maneuver. Hungary's castles were not better fortifications than the walls of Chinese cities the Mongols had overcome. The Hungarian army of 1285 was not more skilled than the warriors the Mongols had defeated from Persia to Poland. What was different was the strategic environment. A kingdom that had deliberately, systematically, at enormous cost, reorganized itself to impose the one condition the Mongol military system could not overcome. Waiting. The Mongol withdrawal after the failed 1285 invasion marked the effective end of their westward expansion. The Golden Horde would continue to exist for centuries, but its power was diminished. It never again seriously threatened to push into Central Europe. The demonstration that a kingdom could resist, not through military genius or superior numbers, but through patient, methodical preparation, changed the strategic equation. Other European powers took note. Fortification programs accelerated. Military reforms that incorporated lessons from both the 1241 catastrophe and the 1285 success spread across the continent. The Mongol storm that had seemed unstoppable in the 1240s had found its limit not at some great river or mountain range, but at the walls of castles that one determined king had spent decades building. Béla's decree from the 1240s, that castles should be built, where the people may find refuge if they have to retreat from threatening dangers, sounds defensive, even defeatist. But it contained a profound understanding. You don't have to defeat an enemy to survive them. You only have to make conquest cost more than it's worth. The ruins of those castles still dot the Hungarian landscape. Some survived through the Ottoman period and beyond. Others crumbled or were rebuilt so many times that the original 13th century stonework is impossible to distinguish. A few became tourist sites, where visitors walk battlements that were designed not for the romance of medieval architecture but for the grimly practical purpose of denying the most fearsome army in the world the quick victory it needed. The secret weapon wasn't a weapon at all. It was patience, systematically engineered. It was a king who understood that he couldn't win, building a kingdom that couldn't lose. It was 44 years of construction, of political compromise, of mortgaging royal power to create a defensive network so comprehensive that it changed what invasion itself meant. And it was the cold, unglamorous truth that sometimes survival isn't about the battle you win, but about the ones you refuse to fight.